Let's talk about how the source object for your binding is provided to that binding. The source object that's going to be used is explicitly determined by the way the binding is defined. Typically, it's going to use the data context of the element that the binding is on. And we've seen that in previous demos, as well as talked about how the data context can flow down to that element by being set on some parent element. But there's actually three other ways that you can explicitly point to some source object. First one is a relative source binding. Relative source is a property on the binding that you can point to a relative source markup extension that indicates where the source object can be found in the element hierarchy. So it's called relative source because it's kind of like a relative path within the element hierarchy. And there's a couple different forms this can take on that we'll look at in a demo. Another way you can specify the source object is with an element name. If you're going to use some other element within the current UI as the source object, then you can use element name equals and the name of that element. And it will locate that element in the visual tree and treat that as the source object. And then the last way is to use the source property on a binding. Source property has to point to some object reference that you want to use as the source. Now, the only reasonable way to get an object reference down into the source property is to use a static resource that points to some object in a resource collection. So let's see all of these in some demos.